Good day, everyone. I'm Dale Standen, President of the Peterborough Historical Society. Welcome to PHS Talks, a series of virtual presentations on historical subjects produced by the Historical Society. Today, I'm pleased to welcome as our speaker, Michael Peterman, Professor Emeritus of English Literature at Trent University. Professor Peterman has published extensively on Canadian writers, and especially on the rich literary history of those who lived and wrote in the region around Peterborough and Lakefield, Ontario. In this episode of PHS Talks, he reflects upon this remarkable contribution to Canadian literature. Welcome, Professor Peterman.
Thank you, Dale. I'm giving a little talk on Lakefield as the cradle of Canadian literature, and it's subtitled Early Literary Writing in Peterborough and Lakefield. I begin with the startling and rather self-congratulatory phrase, the cradle of Canadian literature. It was coined, I believe, by residents of the village of Lakefield early in the 20th century to celebrate the writings and the literary legacy of Catharine Partrayel, her sister Susanna Moody, and their younger brother, Sam Strickland. They all came to Durrow in the early 1830s from Raden Hall, their family home near Southwold in Suffolk, England, and they settled in or near the small village of Lakefield. A century later, all three of the Stricklands were honored by a provincial plaque to each of them in recognition of their literary and cultural achievements. But that was, of course, a belated public gesture on behalf of the province of Ontario. It recognized their important literary efforts undertaken so many years earlier. Of course, writing for publication was a Strickland family habit. 6 of the 8 Strickland siblings became published authors, and 5 of the 6 sisters wrote for pay in the 1820s. Because Sam, as a young man, chose to settle near Lakefield, the Kawarthas were the area that soon welcomed 2 of his sisters as immigrants. Once the Moodies and Traills had settled in and around Durrow by 1834, literary productions began to happen with Lake Catchawanook as their focus. But there were other writers a generation later who we can add to the list. James McCarroll and Isabella Crawford were both Irish by birth and both became important poets in the province. Notably as well, during their time in and around Peterborough, they each had passing interactions with the Stricklands. Together then, the 5 make up an impressive roster that more than justifies the cradle label. Additionally, it allows me to amplify the case for the Kawarthas as a particular and important nurturing ground for the beginnings of Canadian literature as we know it today. Such a concentration of literary energy and talent was rare in any village or town in Canada during those early days of settlement. So I'll begin with Susanna, Sam, and Catharine. In the 1830s and until the time of Confederation, Canada was a set of colonies spread across a vast northern landscape. West of Upper Canada seemed like a terra incognita, spreading towards and past the Rocky Mountains. This landmass was called British North America to distinguish it from the United States to the south. The West was then fur trade territory and the homelands of numerous indigenous peoples. To most whites, it was an unknown world. But in the 1830s, Upper Canada, or Canada West, what we now know as Ontario, was a rough, mostly unsettled region. It was thinly populated and in most areas was very challenging to farm, especially because of the Canadian Shield. Durrow Township, for instance, was on the edge of the Shield and not an easy place to clear and farm efficiently. Sam Strickland, who in 1825 immigrated to Darlington, you should think here of Bowmanville as the place, saw the possibilities of settlement, both in terms of farming and the development of the waterways that passed through Lakefield and Peterborough. After working for a time for the Canada Company, he sold the property he had bought in Peterborough. That land was actually, we now know it as Nichols Oval. And in 1831, he moved his family with axe and shovel in hand to the mostly unsettled shores of Lake Catchimanook. Once settled there, he persuaded his two married sisters to join him and his family on adjacent lots to the north of his property. Catharine and Susanna had recently married pensioned British soldiers who, because of their services during the Napoleonic Wars, were entitled to free land in the colony. Through Sam's influence, John Moody and Thomas Traill were able to access their land grants on the shores of Lake Catchimanook. It was the experience of making a life for one's young family in the rough pioneering conditions of that day that led to the important writings of Susanna Moody, Catharine Partrayel, and finally Sam himself. Once in Canada, Susanna Moody started things off by writing several poems for newspapers like the Coburg Star and the New York Albion. With a baby daughter in hand, she was eager to continue her writing career in whatever way she could find in Canada. Quieter and less ambitious, it was surprising that Catharine Partrayel scooped her busy sister by preparing a short volume of letters home to Suffolk in 1835. She called it The Backwoods of Canada. It was written with surprising speed and was published in London very quickly by Charles Knight. In January 1836, Catharine's elder sister, Agnes Strickland, made the arrangements with Knight. Traill was a naturally upbeat woman, writing to provide useful guidance and practical information for British women facing the many challenges of immigration to Canada. She had been married for 4 years and as yet had no children. Her credo was to be useful and up and doing rather than passive, resistant, and self-pitying. She wrote the book in her log cabin on the western shore of Lake Catchimanook, using copies of actual letters she had sent home and notes from her detailed daily diaries. She was most fortunate that her publisher, Charles Knight, desperately needed a book for one of the 2 series that he had contracted to produce for the Society of Useful Knowledge. Knight placed Traill's book in his Library of Entertaining Knowledge, as it was called, where it went through at least 10 editions in different formats. Its popularity was evident in that it was carried to the New World by many immigrant families, grateful for its factual information and its steadily encouraging outlook. The Society paid her £115, a lot of money in those days, but she erred by selling the copyright to her publisher, Charles Knight. It was a mistake that cost her dearly in later years when her family desperately needed money. Nor did she put her name on the book. Rather, it was subtitled, Being the Letters from the Wife of an Immigrant Officer, Illustrative of the Domestic Economy of British America. The Traill cabin was located on the southern edge of what is now Lakefield College School, next to Sam's property. The Moodies lived about a mile north of the Traills, where the Stenner Road meets the lake. Susanna was a more aggressive and self-promoting writer than Catharine, especially in her interest as a poet. It is my view, though, that her presence so close to Catharine by 1834 led Catharine to write her account of settlement as quickly as she did. After all, she'd only been living in the backwoods for less than 2 years. For her part, her sister Susanna waited nearly a decade before beginning her own account of life in the backwoods. She was there from 1834 until the end of 1839, think again of the Stenner Road, and had endured and undergone many hardships. In those years, she learned hard lessons about the demands of pioneering and what bad neighbors were really like. I see her 2-volume book, The Roughing It in the Bush, as her informed answer to her sister Kate's Backwoods of Canada. Roughing It in the Bush, which began as magazine sketches in 1847, was published as a book by Richard Bentley in London in 1852. It made a big impact there as it offered a much more personal and emotionally charged outlook than the Backwoods of Canada. At its heart, it dramatized the fundamental contradiction in the pioneering experience. On the one hand, it argues that to immigrate as a gentlewoman to a colony like Canada is a recipe for failure, involving a set of painful, depressing, and enervating experiences. On the other hand, it shows that the experience could also be positive and invigorating, a splendid test of one's fortitude and vision. In this sense, in the bush, life in the bush was the making of Moody as an individual, a writer, and a woman. She admits as much on several occasions in the text. Roughing in the Bush attracted a lot of attention when it first appeared, and rightly so, given the dramatic and engaging first-person narrative it offers. Oddly, it led directly to Sam's book, 27 Years in Canada West, published by Bentley as well in 1853. Sam was a farmer, not a writer, although he wrote well. But after Moody's book appeared, Agnes Strickland, by this time Britain's reigning expert on royalty and nobility, was deeply upset by her sister's subject matter, especially the images of crude and sometimes criminal settlers that conditions forced her to mix with. Agnes encouraged Sam to write a kind of rebuttal based on his own pioneering experiences. He had recently come to England after his wife's death, and he took up the challenge readily enough under Agnes's close guidance. For her part, Agnes was increasingly upset by Roughing the Bush. The more she thought about it, the more it bothered her. In particular, she was preoccupied by the damage the book did to the good name and reputation, read here, genteel name and reputation of the Strickland family. Now befriended by numerous aristocratic families, in her own work, Agnes cut off Susanna totally. She never again wrote to her, outraged as she was that her sister had dedicated the book to her without permission. James McCarroll, whose dates are 1814 to 1892, immigrated with his Irish Protestant family to the Emily area in 1831. As a teenager, he personally chose the small village or town of Peterborough as his community and set up shop initially as a shoemaker. Having no interest in farming, he taught music and primary school before becoming the editor of the town's second newspaper, the Peterborough Chronicle, which he edited and later owned from 1843 to 1846. He was a flamboyant and outspoken reform editor whose reputation for aggressive journalism preceded him until his print shop burned down in July 1846. Narrowly escaping bankruptcy, he continued to write poetry while becoming a music teacher in Coburg. In 1849, the reform government of Sir Francis Hincks granted him a patronage position in the colony's customs department. In time, various customs appointments took him to other towns in Canada West before he settled in Toronto in 1856 as the outdoor surveyor for customs. Peterborough, however, remained his special place even after he moved to New York State in 1866. However, until recently, he has been a forgotten literary figure both in Peterborough and in Canada because so much of what he wrote has been lost over time. As an example, only 3 of his weekly Peterborough Chronicle issues have survived, though he edited and wrote most of the copy for more than 150 of them before the fire. The fire, of course, destroyed what he had. Most of those issues would have contained a poem of his, along perhaps with a story or a sketch. A sampling of those poems can be found in his later collection, Madeline and Other Poems, which was published in New York City in 1889. While he worked in Peterborough, he knew Catharine Partrayel, then living across the river in Ashburnham, and he was in contact with Susanna Moody while she and her husband edited the Victoria magazine in Belleville. That was in 1847. Born in Dublin in 1846, Isabella Crawford grew up first in Paisley, Ontario, and then in Lakefield, before moving to Peterborough in 1870. Hers is a very sad family story that includes the deaths of numerous siblings and the alcoholism of her doctor father, who practiced first in Paisley, then in Lakefield and Peterborough. In Lakefield, she was friends with two of Catharine Partrayel's daughters. Having resettled in Peterborough in the early 1870s, she played the organ at St. John's Church and began writing for pay. She and her sister Naomi contracted to write for a Montreal magazine called The Favorite in 1872, and at least two magazines owned by Frank Leslie in New York in 1874. She published her Indigenous story, Winona or the Foster Sisters, for The Favorite in 1872. When, after the deaths of her father and Naomi, sister Naomi, she and her widowed mother moved to Toronto, she committed herself fully to writing poetry and published her only book of poems, Old Spooks Pass, Malcolm's Katie and Other Poems, in 1884. Meanwhile, James McCarroll had, by 1871, become an employee of the Frank Leslie Company in New York. As an editor working on both Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper and Frank Leslie's Chimney Corner, he seems to have helped Crawford, then a mostly unknown writer, to publish two serialized novels and many short stories in the two Leslie periodicals. I might add that Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, which was a weekly, was kind of like the CNN of its day. It had more information quickly for more people. He seems to, while the actual connection between McCarroll and Crawford remains somewhat sketchy, it is likely rooted in Peterborough, where three of McCarroll's four daughters were living and teaching music at the time. They must have known Crawford there, perhaps through St. John's Church or their shared musical interests. It is my view that they offered to connect her with their father in New York City. It was clear to both McCarroll and Crawford at the time that if one wanted to make money from writing, the best way to do it was to produce prose fiction by the page for story magazines like The Favorite and The Chimney Corner. Famously, Crawford later was deemed by some critics in Canada as the first writer in the country to make her living by her pen. But then you need to think about Moody and Traill and McCarroll. She certainly had good examples to follow in all cases. Thus, the literary legacy of the Stricklands in Ontario persisted into a second generation. They all struggled to find publishers and to make at least a partial living by their pens. That struggle did not diminish despite the passing of time and the country's slowly advancing cultural reach. In all, the five writers I have profiled here have contributed impressively to the growing fame of the Kawarthas region as a haven for writers of talent. We thus might expand that early label from Lakefield, the cradle of Canadian literature, to include Peterborough itself. Thank you.